evening. The latest developments on the Optus outage in just a moment. But we begin tonight with shocking breaking news. A brutal anti-Semitic attack on a Jewish man in a Sydney park in broad daylight. We can reveal exclusive details of this vicious and sustained assault by a group of Palestinian supporters. The Jewish man was at a children's playground in Arncliffe in Sydney's inner west on Saturday, October 28. He saw a poster advertising a Palestinian rally that was half torn down. He tore the rest of it down. It was past the event's date. But a father at the children's playground saw him do this, came up to him, asked if he supported Israel, and started threatening him. He said to him, and I quote, "I will murder you." The Jewish man immediately rang police, but they didn't turn up in time. He'd been on the way to a friend's place when this all unfolded. He didn't have his car with him. A crowd of pro-Palestinian men and women gathered around him, yelling slurs and insults. He was completely outnumbered. As he was surrounded by the shouting group, he felt a knock to the back of his head. He immediately fell to the ground. As he lay there, unable to move, 3 big men pummeled him, taking turns punching and kicking him. He says he took at least 12 punches to the head. And I've seen the photographs today. The man had 2 black eyes, concussion, and 4 fractures to his spine. He ended up in hospital for 4 days. As the men attacked him, they said, and I quote, "Why are you in our area? Go back to Vaucluse." And they called him a pro-Jew dog, among other awful insults. I spoke with the Jewish man today. He's not going to speak publicly. Understandably, he's very afraid for his safety. He says he regrets taking the poster down advertising a Palestinian rally, but he says he never imagined he'd be brutally attacked in a park during daylight in the heart of Sydney. He says he now feels very lucky that he's alive. After the attack, a passerby called police. By the time St George Police turned up, the attackers had fled. New South Wales Police have this afternoon confirmed to us that they are now investigating. They said in a statement, New South Wales ambulance paramedics treated a 44-year-old man for facial injuries after he was allegedly assaulted by 3 men after he had removed a poster from a pole. He was taken to St Vincent's Hospital in a stable condition. Police say anyone who may have any information, dashcam footage, or witness the incident should contact Crime Stoppers on 1800 33 000. So anyone who saw that vicious attack taking place or the men threatening him before the attack started, that's on Saturday, October 28 in Arncliffe, contact police. It's understood that police are now analysing CCTV from the surrounding streets. And this latest sickening incident in Sydney now comes after a man was killed by pro-Palestinian protesters in Los Angeles. We're going to come back to that story, have more on it later in the program. But now to the catastrophic Optus outage that's brought chaos and confusion to millions of Australians today. Around 10.2 million Optus customers awoke today to find they had no mobile phone coverage or internet access at all. Hospitals, transport networks, banks, and an estimated 400,000 businesses were all thrown into chaos by this outage. Calls to emergency services made from a landline didn't work, with Optus urging customers to use a mobile phone to call 000. Even as we go to air tonight, there are still customers without reception. Optus Chief Executive Kelly Bayer Rosemarin hasn't clarified exactly what went wrong, and she's been roundly criticised for her handling of this outage. Critics are calling it a PR disaster. Despite the outage starting around 4 a.m. or even earlier, Optus didn't call a press conference this morning to explain what was unfolding and let people know when the network would be restored. Instead, they released a bland statement saying they were aware of the issue and apologising for any inconvenience caused. Rather than directly speak to media outlets, Bea Rosemarin did a phone interview with the ABC where she encouraged customers to log on to the Optus website. Bizarre advice when customers had no internet access. She also told them to go and find a place with Wi-Fi. Have a listen.
So there are definitely places where people can connect to Wi-Fi. There's plenty of organisations that offer Wi-Fi. Our stores have connectivity. Our messaging is still working through the My Optus app. And so we hope that customers are taking advantage of all those other avenues.
A cyber attack was the immediate question, but Bea Rosemarin also said there was no indication that this outage was a result of hackers.
There is no indication that there's anything to do with cyber at this stage. Our systems are actually very stable. We provide great coverage to our customers. This is a very, very rare occurrence. And when I have more information about the root cause, I will be the first to let all our customers know.
Optus also put out a statement on Facebook and Twitter, but they turned off comments to escape criticism. Communications Minister Michelle Rowland held a press conference, but she had no answers about what had happened to cause the outage, and she instead called on Optus to communicate with customers to be transparent and timely. She said there was a deep fault in the system.
I think Optus needs to make sure they step up and communicate with people. My understanding is that this is a fault deep in the core. The core network basically encompasses everything from routing to electronics. So it is a fault that is quite fundamental to the network.
Michelle Rowland said many customers would now consider changing services, and there were queues outside Telstra stores today as people tried to switch telcos.
I do reiterate the TIO's statement that it's important, especially for small businesses, to keep receipts so that any recourse and any redress that may be available to them has that evidentiary base.
Shadow Communications Minister David Coleman then criticised the government for failing to provide advice to Australians who couldn't access services impacted by the outage.
This is a catastrophic incident. There's no precedent for an incident of this kind, and Optus needs to do everything it can to get this resolved, communicate with its customers, and the government needs to get on the front foot.
Then at around 1 p.m, Optus services in some areas began working again. But Bea Rosemarin still said she didn't know what had caused the problem. She did apologise for the outage.
The good news is that we have a path to restoring the whole network, and so we're bringing it up progressively as we speak.
So it is up and running in some places?
For all our customers. Yeah, and we'll be working through getting it up and running everywhere as soon as we can.
And how long are we expecting? Give us some sort of time frame to look toward.
Look, we're working through it progressively, so we're going as fast as we possibly can. Our main priority has been on restoring service to customers.
It's unclear how you fix a problem when you don't know the root cause, how you restore service without knowing what sparked the problem in the first place. It's not clear if there's information that's not being shared publicly or if Optus genuinely doesn't know what caused this disruption. Tech experts today said the most likely cause is a core network issue, potentially from an overnight systems upgrade that had gone awry. And we'll have tech expert Trevor Long on the show a bit later. Now, Optus is owned by Singaporean giant Singtel, and it just so happens that the Optus board is in Australia at the moment. The Fin Review reports that the board had a front row seat to this debacle and incompetence. To have the Singaporean heavies in town while the network spectacularly fails is obviously very bad, the Fin reports. But Bea Rosemarin's early actions mean the board now have a front row seat to an unfolding PR disaster. The paper reports the last time the board was in Australia was September last year, when Optus was then dealing with the fallout of a cyber attack. And the board today witnessed firsthand how much of Australia was brought to a standstill as a result of their outage. Hospitals nationwide that were connected through Optus couldn't operate properly. Banks, including Commonwealth, Westpac and ANZ, said incoming calls might have been affected. Healthcare services, including the Children's Helpline, an estimated 400,000 businesses, Uber drivers and Service New South Wales all had phone lines down. And retail businesses that relied on Optus were unable to operate except through cash. Optus says, as you heard earlier, that it'll be looking into compensation for affected businesses once they're back up and running. They'll have no choice but to spend millions compensating those who couldn't work today. And there'll also be a major hit to their bottom line as customers switch to Telstra. All right, Sky News contributor, Herald Sun columnist Steve Price joins me now. Steve, thanks for your time. Look, this Optus debacle affected more than 10 million Australians today. I'm with Optus as well. Everyone, was affected because your life is completely lived online, whether it's the apps on your phone, being able to call people, not to mention small businesses. Reported 400,000 small businesses who couldn't operate properly this morning. What's your view on the extent to which Optus will have to give compensation to the businesses and others affected?
Well, Sharri, great to see you again. This is a PR disaster on steroids when you think about it. I mean, you mentioned there that they had that hack a year ago. I don't think anyone got properly compensated out of that, and here we go again. And I heard the interview originally done by the CEO on Radio 3AW in Melbourne just after lunchtime. Now, she'd not been available all day, so she was not available for breakfast radio, morning radio. She then seemed to be reading from some PR sheet that had been handed out so she could use all these terms. And she even used the term, and can you believe this, that Optus was customer champion, or a customer champion is the policy that they have for the company. I mean, none of their customers felt like champions today, and this really is going to be a major issue because, as you said, the Fin Review reporting the board was here, and the timing's horrible given that they were here a year ago when that hack happened. And I heard talkback callers today, Sharri, saying that at major Westfield shopping centres around Australia, there were queues of people outside the Telstra store, all wanting to urgently get off Optus and sign up to Telstra. So it's going to be a financial punish for them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was the same in Sydney today as well, those queues outside the Telstra stores. Amid all the chaos, Steve, it was reported today in the Daily Mail that a photo shoot took place at the mansion of the Optus CEO, Kellerbaya Rosemarin. It was staged for the architect who renovated the Vaucluse home. Look, this is very bad timing. The photographs splashed across the Daily Mail as flowers and other things were brought into her home.
Talk about karma coming to get you. I mean, the timing couldn't have been worse for that family. I mean, no one begrudges the fact that they've got a nice house in Vaucluse, but the fact that they let that photo shoot go ahead was, again, a PR disaster for the CEO and the Optus company. I mean, Australians, as you say, are wedded to their mobile phones, and what you want is reliability. Now, I'm with Telstra, luckily, so I wasn't affected. But, I mean, if you were trying to contact somebody today, an elderly relative, I mean, you have that situation where they've got alarm devices that are loaded into Optus if you have a fall at home. You had hospitals who couldn't operate. You had little coffee shops who were having to write out IOUs. I heard one woman today say she had served 100 customers, hoping that they were honest enough to come back and pay her tomorrow. It's a PR disaster for Optus. And you saw in the share price, Ross Greenwald reported just before you that Singtel's share price in Singapore has gone down as well, and Telstra's share price went up. It's a complete disaster for that company, and you'd have to say the future of that CEO has to be in question.
Yeah, well, and also we need still a proper explanation as to what went wrong today. Optus still hasn't answered that question. When you've got 10.2 million Australians affected, they have to say, well, fine, they've said it wasn't a cyber attack. So what was it, and how do they know that the problem's not going to happen again? Now, Steve, of course, we saw the 13th rate rise yesterday. New research today indicating that this rise could be the tipping point that means that some homes or some households will lose their homes, that they will no longer be able to make their mortgage repayments. Also, reports in the Australian today that say that RBA has effectively cancelled Christmas. Some economists predict we're still to see another rate rise at the next board meeting on December 5 because inflation just isn't under control.
I tell you what stood out for me today. The Daily Telegraph did some great numbers. You got a $750,000 mortgage, and you add up the 13 interest rate rises that have happened since May last year, you are now paying, after tax, $1,815 more a month on your mortgage. So, you know, in rough terms, $450 after tax a week. Now, if you're on a $750,000 mortgage, I mean, that's not a mansion in places like Sydney, Brisbane, Adelaide, Melbourne or Perth. And so you were probably living pretty close to the mark when you signed up to that mortgage anyway, to have a $750,000 mortgage. I think a lot of people are going to have to cancel Christmas. I mean, your spending on things like Christmas presents is going to be brought into question. Now, people say, oh, well, you know, this is just people over-exaggerating. Well, no, it's not. And there's still a hell of a lot of people, thousands of Australians, who are still due to come off fixed mortgages, which is going to even make the problem worse. And if we get another one of these in December... Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just going to point out that it's not just the mortgages that have gone up. It's every facet of our lives is more expensive. And for people who were just making ends meet already, having these rate rises, 13th, potentially a 14th, plus their electricity bills, plus the cost of petrol, plus the cost of groceries and everyday items, life just becomes too expensive in Sydney.
And we all concentrate on mortgages, don't we? But don't forget that every small business in the country also has bank loans and their interest rate payments go up as well. So it's impacting on the small business community just as badly. I mean, we are, no doubt about it, in a cost of living crisis. And I don't know about you, Sharri, but I just don't see the urgency in the new Albanese government, led by Treasurer Chalmers, to do something about it rather than just getting the Reserve Bank to hit people who are trying to pay off a mortgage over the head every month.
And as we spoke about last night on the program, there are concerns that the Albanese government's policies, like a big Australia, are making inflation even worse. Now let's move on to another topic. I couldn't believe this story today. The Australian Defence Force is renaming its drone fleet because it's trying to scrap gender-specific language across the armed forces. So this exclusive story in the Australian today, it says that what was previously known as unmanned aircraft systems are now going to be called uncrewed aircraft systems. Unmanned, apparently offensive, now it's uncrewed. Come on, Steve, this is ridiculous.
It's beyond belief. And when you think about it, to be brutally honest about this, you know, we're in the middle of a very ugly conflict in Ukraine with the Russian invasion. We're in the middle of the horror that is unfolding in the Middle East, and we had the terror attack on Israel and now the response. And a lot of those conflicts are using drones. Does anybody in the ADF and sitting on their velvet cushions in Canberra in the top brass's office believe it's an appropriate time to even be talking about this? It is completely ridiculous. Does anyone really think, when you're using drones in a military sense, that term even matters? I mean, where does this garbage actually come from, Sharri? I mean, look, we all know that the top ranks of the Defence Force in Australia are a protected species, but seriously, if Richard Marles doesn't pick up the phone and tell those blokes to shut up, I don't know what he's doing.
Yeah, all right. Just very quickly before you go, Steve, we've seen this report that Malcolm Turnbull has come out and defended Albanese's decision not to visit Israel as calls grow louder for him to make that trip, or other world leaders have. Turnbull said that Australia should leave the showboating to Scott Morrison, claiming a solidarity visit would achieve little. I mean, look, Turnbull has to be given credit for drafting that brilliant letter that was co-signed by 5 other prime ministers, including Tony Abbott and Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd. But this surely has to be more about any bitterness he might feel towards Scott Morrison, because obviously it was the right thing for Scott Morrison to go to Israel, and Albanese should be making the trip.
Why is anyone surprised about Malcolm being a good hater? And the thing that struck me about this story today, Sharri, and you'd appreciate this, Malcolm Turnbull, has he forgotten that he held the seat in Sydney of Wentworth, which has one of the largest Jewish electorate populations in the country, and he's carrying on with stuff like this? I mean, it's just crazy. And look, let's just go back for one moment. Okay, Anthony Albanese's been too busy to go, which is wrong. But even the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, I mean,
exactly.
Do you really think that if the coalition was in power in Canberra that at least the Foreign Minister or the Defence Minister had not gone there?
No one. If the coalition was in power, the Prime Minister would have gone. If Bill Shorten was the Prime Minister, he would have gone. The problem is that both Albanese and Penny Wong are from the Labor left. Steve Price, thank you so much for joining me. Now, still to come, why the case for the COVID-19 lab leak theory has grown stronger by the day. My rival author, one of the only other authors in the world who's written a Wuhan book, retired member of the UK House of Lords, Matt Ridley, joins me next. We're going to meet for the first time. Stay tuned. Welcome back. Well, my next guest is a retired member of the UK House of Lords and a prolific author, known for his articles on science, the environment and economics. Matt Ridley and I both wrote the first two books investigating the origins of COVID-19. Matt's book, Viral, published in November 2021. You can see it on the screen. And my book, What Really Happened in Wuhan, was published a couple of months earlier, both by HarperCollins. And I'm thrilled to say that Matt joins me now live in studio, visiting us from London. We've never met before, so Matt Ridley, it's wonderful to have you here in Sydney and great to meet you.
Sharri, it's great to meet you and congratulations on your work on this topic.
Oh, congratulations on yours. It's so rare to have a conversation with someone who is effectively an expert in this topic. I imagine when you started reporting and investigating whether or not COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, came out of the Wuhan Institute of Virology, you were ridiculed and condemned. What made you persist with it?
Well, I'd written several books about genomes, genomics, etc., so I was very interested in this topic. Colleagues in Parliament were saying to me, might this have come out of a lab? And I was saying, no, the scientists have looked at this and ruled that out. And then I came across bits of research, including from my co-author, Alina Chan, that made me begin to question that. And within a few weeks, I realised that actually the hypothesis that it came out of a lab needed to be taken very seriously indeed. And yes, it was tough. I mean, I was called all sorts of names for believing this, a conspiracy theorist and so on. But it was always a possibility, so it always needed investigating. And we wrote the whole book without knowing the answer, without having a conclusion. But we became more and more convinced that actually this was a very strong possibility. And I think now it's almost overwhelming, the evidence that it probably did come from that lab.
It's so interesting because people always say, oh, there's no evidence that it was a lab leak, when in fact there is a preponderance of evidence that points to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They had serious safety issues, safety breaches. There's evidence that there was a shutdown at the facility. The research they were engaging in was gain-of-function research, reverse genetics, genetically manipulating coronaviruses. They had the world's largest collection of coronaviruses. So much evidence points to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and yet the line you hear from everyone is, there's no evidence, when in fact there's no evidence that it was a natural virus, except that this is how other coronaviruses have emerged previously.
Now, over the years, and it's now 3 years, the evidence for a natural leak in a market has got weaker and weaker. There's still no evidence for an infected animal of any kind, apart from
and everyone's
the original
gone
bats.
hunting. They've
searched and searched. Whereas the evidence that it's not a coincidence that this was the one city in the world where research was happening on this kind of virus more than anywhere else on the planet in those very years before. And the experiments were ramping up in 2017 and 18 on this topic in that city on these kinds of viruses. And the closest relative of this virus that's been found in the wild, that was known up until the point of the pandemic, was in the freezer of the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Yeah. So, as my we then found out that they were proposing an experiment that would have created COVID-19 pretty well. So there's lots of evidence.
You're referring there to the diffuse grant proposal.
Yes.
So for people who aren't up to date, I'll just explain that for the viewers, for the audience. So there was a proposal that the Wuhan Institute of Virology and EcoHealth Alliance, they were looking for funding for the research that they were about to conduct. And they submitted this grant proposal to United States agencies. At least one agency rejected it. We don't know yet whether others may have funded it or may have rejected it. You know, a lot of those US agencies still aren't being transparent. But that funding proposal, scientists we've spoken to and I've interviewed describe it as a blueprint for the creation of SARS-CoV-2. So you can see there in black and white how they were proposing to create a virus like SARS-CoV-2, and it involved reverse genetics and some other techniques that they had been using at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Well, in particular, that proposal involved inserting a thing called a furin cleavage site, which is a significant chunk of genetic material. That chunk of genetic material has turned up in this virus and no other SARS-like virus so far that we've seen on the planet, among hundreds. And it's an insertion. It's not a mutation. It's an addition to the virus. And it's the reason we're having a pandemic. Without that furin cleavage site, this virus would not be nearly as infectious. It would effectively remain a gut virus rather than a lung virus, for example. So that's pretty strong evidence. But what's really shocking about the defuse proposal is that the senior author of it, Peter Daszak of the EcoHealth Alliance, obviously he knew it existed. He didn't tell the world about it. He didn't come forward and say, oh, by the way, you should know that we've put in this proposal. It was found out by a leak a year and a half after the pandemic began.
And Peter Daszak was one of the key figures calling the lab leak theory a conspiracy in a major conflict of interest. He was appointed by the World Health Organization to go in and investigate the origins of the pandemic, even though the funding from the United States had been going to the Wuhan Institute of Virology through his organisation. It's just a stunning conflict of interest. And of course, the Lancet medical journal as well had appointed him to lead their COVID commission until...
Well, even if this one didn't start from a lab, and that's still possible, you know, we don't 100% know what happened, but even if it didn't, the behaviour of scientists and the scientific establishment in not wishing to investigate this strong possibility and in covering up their tracks has, I'm afraid, been utterly disgraceful. And it's a major scandal that needs to be properly looked into.
Yeah. I think one of the other fascinating things that's emerged over the past couple of years is that one of the authors on that grant proposal, where they discussed inserting furin cleavage sites and how they'd create COVID-19 or a virus like it, one of those authors was Ben Hu, who was one of the first, or is suspected of being the very first person in the world, the first cluster of COVID-19, him and his colleagues, and he was hospitalised with COVID-like symptoms around late October or early November 2019. So the very scientist who was conducting this research is believed to be one of the first in the world to fall sick with COVID-19 and had to go to hospital.
Yes, we can't see that evidence yet. We can't see how strongly the US intelligence services believe that Ben Hu was hospitalised with those symptoms. He's denied it. But the other, of the three who were hospitalised around then, according to the intelligence sources, another one was Yu Ping. Now, she turns out to be really important because maybe he, I don't actually know for sure, but I think it's
one of the three was a female.
One of the three, yeah. Was working on exactly the group of viruses that this virus belongs to. The thesis was about the close relatives of SARS-CoV-2, as we now know them. So this is very, these are the people who are actually doing the work that is most likely to have caused the lab leak.
I think it's interesting that in the past couple of months we've seen evidence from the FBI, evidence from the US Congressional Committee that the CIA team who was investigating COVID-19 believed it came from a lab and they were silenced. I broke a story that another intelligence agency, the Defence Intelligence Agency's National Centre for Medical Intelligence, also concluded it was genetically engineered, but they were silenced, stopped from adding input into Joe Biden's 90-day probe. A fourth agency, the Department of Energy, believed it was genetically engineered. So you have all these elements in the intelligence agencies who think the virus was most likely genetically engineered, but then the overall assessment from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence is that this was a natural virus.
Well, there's politics here, isn't there? That assessment came out around the time when Antony Blinken was visiting Beijing, so obviously there would have been pressure to not overplay this. And if this had happened in any other country in the world than China, I think there would have been enormous pressure to do a much greater investigation to find out what went on. And although, as you say, a lot of evidence is emerging from the US, which had been partly funding that lab, nonetheless, it's to China that we look. And, you know, the one thing we really need to see is the database of the viruses they were working on in that lab. And they refused to share it with us. Now, the fact that they refused to share it with us, because it would exculpate them if it didn't have relevant viruses in it, tells you something in itself.
And first taken offline September 2019.
Correct.
Matt Ridley, it's been such a pleasure to chat to you. So wonderful to meet you. Congratulations on your important work. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sharri.
And if you'd like to see Matt speaking while he's here in Australia, he's speaking with the Centre of Independent Studies. You can check out their website for details. After the break, the sickening surge of anti-Semitism here in Australia will return to our top story tonight, those exclusive details about the attack on a Jewish man in broad daylight in Sydney. He landed up in hospital for 4 days. Stay tuned. Welcome back. If you're just tuning in, here are tonight's top 5 stories. Optus has just confirmed with Sky News that services have now been restored and customers should be able to be back online. It follows a 9-hour network outage that affected 10 million customers and 400,000 businesses. Tonight, we've exclusively revealed a Jewish man was attacked in Arncliffe in Sydney on the 28th of October by a group of Palestinian supporters. The 44-year-old was hospitalised for 4 days and left with 4 fractures to his spine. New South Wales Police have confirmed to us they're investigating. The man allegedly behind the wheel of the car that was involved in an horrific crash that killed 2 young boys in Sydney has today faced court. Nicholas Thew has been charged with 9 offences, including dangerous driving occasioning death. The 27-year-old will spend Christmas behind bars. Israeli ground forces are battling Hamas fighters deep inside Gaza, signalling a new stage in the war. It comes as Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu said they would be controlling Gaza's security for an indefinite period. More than 200 Israeli hostages are still being held by Hamas in Gaza. And Kathleen Folbig is tonight one step closer to clearing her name and receiving compensation after the release of a report into her convictions. The head of the inquiry has referred her case to the Court of Criminal Appeal to consider wiping her slate clean. Now, returning to our top story tonight, a major anti-Semitic attack on a Jewish man who was severely bashed in a park in Arncliffe, Sydney. He took at least 12 punches to the head. He had 2 black eyes, concussion, and 4 spinal fractures as a result of a group of pro-Palestinian supporters surrounding him and 3 large men pummeling him. He was in hospital for 4 days. He recalls the men calling him insults like pro-Jew dog, and they said to him, "Why are you in our area? Go back to Vaucluse." I spoke with the man today. He's not going to speak publicly. Completely understandable. He's very afraid for his safety. He says he's lucky to be alive. New South Wales Police have told us this evening that they are investigating and they ask that anyone who has information on the identities of these men should contact Crime Stoppers. Let's bring in tonight's panel now. Joining me is National Senate Leader Bridget McKenzie and Labor MP Andrew Charlton. Welcome to you both. Andrew, we're seeing a clear crisis of anti-Semitism since the October 7 terror attacks in Israel. This example just in the heart of Sydney and Arncliffe, the latest shocking, sickening incident. What needs to be done here? Because the Jewish community are feeling unsafe.
Well, Sharri, from your description, this terrible incident involves at least two crimes. First, a serious assault, and secondly, hate speech under the New South Wales vilification laws of 2018. The police are investigating and should be prosecuting those crimes to the fullest extent. Now, I'm sure that more broadly, many of your viewers would be concerned about a rise in violence and vilification across Australia since the war began. We've seen a number of terrible incidents, including posters that depict Prime Minister Netanyahu as Adolf Hitler, Nazi salutes outside a Jewish museum, anti-Semitism expressed at rallies. We've also seen a tenfold increase in reported incidents of Islamophobia. And let me be clear, no anti-Semitism and no Islamophobia is acceptable in Australia today. The police should be prosecuting and investigating these incidents to the fullest extent.
Bridget McKenzie, do you think we need to see more leadership from the Prime Minister, from the Albanese government on anti-Semitism?
Absolutely, Sharri. I think the Prime Minister could be a lot more forward-leaning about anti-Semitic behaviour. It is at this appalling attack in Sydney. It is also the vilification of our Jewish community and our Israeli brothers and sisters in the Middle East by these protests that are occurring right across the country. And when we said as a global community post-World War II, never again, it was precisely this moment that we didn't want to ever see again in a liberal democracy such as ours. And I know it's been called a crisis of courage, and that is exactly what's required now. Courage from our law enforcement agencies to uphold the law, the Vilification Act that Andrew spoke about, in my own state of Victoria, the Racial and Religious Tolerance Act, needs to be upheld swiftly as soon as these incidences occur, and not have police sitting on their hands, because it is our Jewish community. Kids are afraid to go to school. We've got businesses being targeted simply because they are owned by Jewish Australians. I mean, it is abhorrent, and we need to crack down on it with the full force of the law.
I mean, you mentioned businesses. One of the businesses that there's now this campaign, even a petition against, is Spotlight, you know, the fabric and sewing store. And there's calls for people to boycott Spotlight because people claim that it's, you know, owned or run by Jewish people. I don't even know if that's true or not, but that it's outrageous that businesses are being targeted and that there's boycotts on Australian businesses. It's insane. On a related
I just can't believe it's happening in our country. I really can't. So we've really got to push back as individuals and as leaders.
Yeah. Now, the Australian newspaper Today finally revealed the Muslim cleric who gave that sermon where he said to kill Jews. This is the Muslim cleric in Sydney. They say they've identified him. He's jihadi preacher Wissam Haddad. He's an extremist, obviously, who's expressed support for terror groups, including ISIS. Just a reminder, this was a sermon he gave just 2 weeks ago.
To the invading Jews, we say, by Allah, the day you will be kicked out of Palestine is coming. A day when the stones and the trees will speak and say, "O Muslim, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him."
Andrew, I have to say we've seen a few clips from similar preachers over the past few days, and it feels quite terrifying to hear people speak like that about the community I'm part of. Do you think, or about any Australian, it's extremist, terrorist, incitement to violence. Do you think law enforcement should be charging this cleric or others like him for inciting violence?
Sharri, it's terrible. It has no place in Australia. I understand that the police are investigating this particular case. I understand that they have visited the premises of this cleric and they have spoken to this cleric and that their investigations are ongoing. If there are found to be examples where this cleric has breached Australian law, including anti-vilification laws, then this cleric should be prosecuted for having done so. I also note that very recently in New South Wales, the government has strengthened the anti-vilification laws. That's just in the last couple of months, but specifically to extend those vilification laws to further religious grounds, and that's an appropriate thing to do, and hopefully we start to see some of the benefit of that new legislation coming through.
I mean, Bridget, I feel like, you know, this is so shocking what these extremist preachers have been saying, and I just feel like people are downplaying it or underestimating it. It's not splashed across all of the papers. The ABC is not leading their news with it. You know, do you think people are taking this seriously enough, are reacting properly to the utter hatred we're hearing coming from people's mouths who live in Melbourne and in Sydney?
Absolutely, Sharri. Now, if that was anyone saying that about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, if somebody was saying that about women, the fact that it is someone saying it about our Jewish community tells you a lot, I think, about the latent anti-Semitism which exists in our communities. Because if it was on any other one of those groups I mentioned, they would be feeling the full force of the law. Now, whether he is prosecuted under New South Wales legislation or not is one thing. If this gentleman, if this man is a dual citizen, it is actually up to the Home Affairs Minister in the federal government to cancel his citizenship and make sure he is deported. Because Andrew's right. That commentary has no place in modern Australia, and the government needs to show leadership. It's not enough to leave it to the courts or leave it to the coppers or leave it to the community. It is up to political leaders to call it out, say it's not good enough, and use every lever they have available to them to make sure our Australian community, in all its diversity, are safe.
All right, look, let's move on to the RBA rate rise yesterday afternoon. The RBA lifted the interest rate, or the cash rate rather, to 4.35%. Andrew, economists are now predicting we might have another rate rise at the December 5 board meeting just before Christmas. Why is inflation, do you think, not falling like it was forecast to?
Well, you're right that inflation hasn't fallen the way that it was forecast to. The RBA expected inflation in the September quarter, core inflation that is, to fall to 4.8%. It in fact came in at 5.2%, which was above what was expected. Now, the reason for that was three things. Firstly, fuel prices higher than expected. Rents remain high and financial services costs are increasing. Petrol prices going up is a direct consequence of events overseas, including the war in the Middle East and the decision by OPEC to restrict supply of oil. But the good news in the data is that the ABS showed that the impact of the government's plan is working. Rents would be higher and would have driven more inflation if it hadn't been for the largest increase in Commonwealth rent assistance ever. Childcare costs and childcare inflation would have been higher if it hadn't been for the new childcare subsidies. Energy costs would have been much higher and had a much bigger impact on the inflation print if it hadn't been for the government's energy plan, including rebates. So the data does show that inflation has peaked, and it does show that the government's plan to reduce inflation is working.
Just very quickly, because we've only got a minute left and I want to get to Bridget, but Andrew, do you think there is a chance that inflation is going to become entrenched?
It is entrenched.
Well, I think we're seeing inflation come down. Inflation is at half the level that it was when Bridget was in government. Our current quarterly inflation is half the level than we inherited, so we are seeing it come down. The RBA is forecasting it to get back into the band by the end of next year, and we all want to see that happen.
Okay, very quickly from you, Bridget, what's your view on this?
Well, the RBA was very clear that inflation is now higher for much longer than it expected or anticipated, and that means it's hurting everyday Australians more than it needs to. And the reasons are because the Labor government hasn't been able to control their spending. They've got an additional $188 billion into our economy than we had in our May budget last year. And food prices, for instance, I know Andrew ran through the list of issues, but food has gone up in excess of 8%. They've also slugged farmers with a biosecurity tax. They've slugged our truckies with a tax, which meant that has all flown through to increase prices for families at the checkout. So it's a terrible day, and I just think families are really doing it tough. And meanwhile, this government talks of, you know, red carpet rides and Qantas bromances. Australians want their Prime Minister at home and actually dealing with this stuff, which he doesn't seem to want to do.
Yeah, all right. Bridget McKenzie, Andrew Charlton, thank you both so much for your time. Now, after the break, I'll speak to a tech expert about what actually happened behind the Optus outage today. That's after this quick break. Welcome back. Well, more than 13 hours after a major outage, Optus has only just confirmed that all services have now been restored and customers should be back online. Let's bring in tech expert Trevor Long. Trevor, this has been a big day for you as well covering this. Thank you so much for your time. What actually happened? Optus hasn't really told us.
That's the biggest problem, Sharri. The Optus announcements, every release they've made tells us nothing about what happened. It tells us they're sorry, but it doesn't tell us what has happened. And what that causes is massive speculation. There's speculation of power outages. There's speculation of upgrades to equipment that went wrong. There's speculations of a simple equipment failure. We don't know. And so for every hour that Optus fails to give us some indication of what happened, we're just going to speculate more, and that's bad for Optus.
Look, you've said today that this is the biggest telecommunications outage in Australian history. This is clearly major, 10.2 million people affected. Optus seemed to try and downplay it today. Wouldn't it have been a better approach to just reflect the frustration that businesses, that families, that hospitals, that transport networks were feeling and facing?
Spot on. They absolutely missed the mark here, and they should have learned from the data breach last year. They needed to come out early. They needed to be sorry. They needed to talk openly to the public and not hide for 7 or 8 hours like they did. So unfortunately, that lack of communication with their customers is exactly what is upsetting customers now and literally driving them to other telcos. We've already seen people queuing up for other SIM cards. We've seen people go to online websites like Airtasker getting other people to bring them new SIM cards because they didn't have time. It's difficult to deal with not having any connectivity in your business, let alone your home. And I don't know how they recover from that because they handled it very badly.
And what about compensation? Optus is going to have to surely compensate, particularly businesses, for the impact this morning.
Let's remember they didn't compensate anyone over the data breach, over loss of data, because the CEO, Kelly Bayer-Rosmarin, continued to say no one was actually affected, despite the fact that 10 million people's details were stolen. So a compensation here for businesses must be in the line with the losses today. If you couldn't accept payments today other than cash, you lost money. So Optus needs to have some responsibility in that. But for the average user, I don't see you getting much more than, you know, a small discount on your monthly bill or perhaps a free data weekend or something like that, which is, it got precedent. Telstra did the same thing several years ago. They have to come out tomorrow with a public announcement for their customers as a measure of their sorrow.
And all of this unfolded, of course, when the board of Optus happened to be in Australia, and the last time they were in Australia was September last year when that cyber hack happened. Trevor Long, thank you so much for your time. That's all we've got time for today. Thank you for watching. I'll be back 5 o'clock tomorrow, and here's Peter Credlin.